Hi everyone, my name is Opar and I'm a developer advocate at IBM. And today I'm talking to Nicholas Hypla. Hey Nicholas,
Hey, Opka.
how are you doing today?
Very good.
So Nicholas is a senior developer advocate at IBM as well, and leads the cloud native containers focal group within IBM. So I'm really interested, Nicholas, to talk to you today. I saw recently you posted a blog article
Mhm.
on why enterprises should modernize applications. So
Exactly.
I read through the article. I found it to be very interesting. I think as developers, we are so much in the weeds of creating buttons and graphics and APIs and backend services. I think sometimes it's important to step back and look at this topic from a 20,000 feet view. So my first question to you, and I'm sure everybody else wants to know as well. Um, what does it mean to modernize an app, and what does the modern application look like?
Yeah, I think the best reason to modernize applications is, in one word, agility. Because, I worked in the product development for a long time, and I remember exactly that it took sometimes like 3 years to create a new release, right? We used the good old waterfall model, and that just doesn't work anymore, right? You don't want to update to a new version like every other year or so, but you want to do it multiple days a day, if possible, multiple times a day. And I think that's really one of the things why you should modernize your applications. You can be much more agile, you can innovate, you can try new things, you can fall back and roll back if it doesn't work. And that's one of the nice things, because app modernization is much more than just a technology change. It's not only about putting an app into a container. It's about a completely different culture. It's about, working together in a team on a set of microservices and, programming cloud native applications together rather than, just doing coding or just doing DevOps engineering, right? And that is one of the big differences and value adds here. You can deliver new functionality much more frequently and easier than before. Obviously, you can also save costs and you provide a better user experience, and I'm sure we can talk about that. But I think agility is really the main reason why you want to do that.
I see, that's very interesting. So it's not modernization. When people think of modernization, they think of look and feel, but it's not necessarily that. We are here. I feel like we're talking about the sort of the end-to-end life cycle of developing and pushing to production changes quickly.
Absolutely. I mean, the user experience plays also an important role, right? Like if you modernize an application, you move it to another infrastructure, but you remain the, old user experience. You might not get the acceptance from users that you might, wish for, but it's certainly part of that.
So very true. All right, thanks, Nicholas. That's a great introduction. But when we talk about agility and constantly updating an app, and you said you also you use the terms updating multiple times a day. I'm guessing our DevOps are probably the backbone of modernization or app modernization in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, as I said, right, it's not only a technology problem or challenge, right? It's much more about changing the culture in your enterprise. And and also the first thing that you really should do when thinking about app modernization is not necessarily to look for tools that convert
Hmm.
VM into a container. It's much more about, people modernization. Like, you have to understand technologies, you need to have the right skills. Like if you want to modernize, you need to understand the goal. And if you don't understand how to write modern applications, then it doesn't make sense to try to attempt, modernizing your applications, right? So you need to know about Kubernetes, OpenShift, cloud native, and all these technologies. And only then it makes sense to start the journey. So yes, it's much more than just technology.
It's much more than just DevOps and technology. Well, thank you for that, because I feel like just made the mistake that a lot of people will make and jump directly into tools and thinking about, okay, how can I do this? What are the tools available to do this? But you're right, we have to take a step back. I remember back when we did push once a couple of months or even once a year, there was a lot of pressure on testing a lot and making sure nothing breaks because you're only pushing once a couple of months. And so if you break something, that was a very big deal. It still is with app modernization, but it's amazing that now you're able to do that multiple times a day. So in a way, I think
Yeah.
it takes off a little pressure from the developer as well,
Mhm.
wouldn't you say?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think the main difference here is that you do not patch systems anymore. Like, you don't do an SSH to a virtual machine and upload some security fix, right? That's not the model anymore. But instead, you have these images and versions of images. And if there's something wrong with your new release, just roll back to the old release, right? And you are safe. So that's the big change here in thinking, and it's less risk, and that's why it's so
Mhm.
much easier to update frequently. You can do things like A/B rollouts or testing, blue-green deployments, canary rollouts. All of that is really simple, especially with tools like Istio, right, which has Istio has it built in, or Knative. You can do things like easily scaling up and down, all of these things. So it's less risk, and I think that's something that makes developers more comfortable to really use this new functionality and try things and innovate faster.
Yeah, be more confident in what you're developing and pushing out. Absolutely. I was also, in your blog, you list out 10 reasons as to why app modernization makes sense, and we went through some of those just now. But if we were to go through the 10 reasons that you have on the blog, if people haven't read the blog, I'll have the description or I'll have the URL in the description of this video. But let's go through them real quick, Nicholas, if you don't mind.
Mhm.
I thought they were all really interesting. So the first one you have is reduce resources. When you move from the old way of doing things to a more agile, modern development.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, so I mean, one kind of obvious difference here is, right, that by using containers, you simply use less resources, right? You don't have to have these rather big VMs anymore because, you can run everything in a container. You run your workload in a sandbox. It's isolated from each other. They share the same host, and it's just more efficient. So that's, one kind of obvious example. But there are other examples, like if you upgrade to modern frameworks, you can save a lot of resources. And a good example is the OpenJ9 JVM. So that's the Java virtual machine. And IBM open sourced, I think, 2 years ago or so. We have used it for almost decades internally in our offerings and services. And it was designed to run in small handheld devices like the Nokia devices.
Mhm.
And that's why it's perfect to be used in containers, right? So for example, compared to the standard, let's say, hotspot JVM, it requires only 50% of the memory and it starts almost twice as fast, right? So it's a huge difference. And you don't even have to change a single line of code. Like your application can be untouched. All you need to do is to change the JVM and you can use, less resources and save a lot of money because in the cloud, it's all about how much memory do you need and what do you need for the compute, like what CPUs and how long, and that's what basically determines the price, the costs, and you can save a lot if you use JVM like OpenJ9. I mean, just as one example, but in general, there are many new modern frameworks that help you to modernize your app without really changing code, and that's I think something that you can basically use for every application without having a big risk of damaging something or having to retest everything.
Right. So there's the underlying platform that you're developing on, for example, the JVM OpenJ9 you mentioned, but then also with other tooling and platforms in cloud native, you have the ability to scale up and down as needed. By the way, a lot of people don't realize and don't know this, but IBM is a major contributor and benefactor of open source solutions. And from what I've been reading, this whole modernization and cloud native goes back to the open source roots. Can you explain that a little bit, please?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm a big fan of open source myself, and I think basically every developer is, right? Because if you have open source skills, you can use them for your new job, your new role, whatever, right? Your new assignment, and everyone loves to do that. But it's not only that, it's also, license costs. I mean, obviously you need someone who supports you if there's something wrong. And IBM and Red Hat and others, they very often, in fact, in most cases, they have offerings to support certain open source packages or libraries, right? But that's still much cheaper than having how can I say that? I don't want to call it legacy, but the commercial, kind of classic offerings. Like for example, to make it more concrete, Open Liberty is a really modern application server runtime. It's available as open source. IBM provides support. And it's certainly, I mean, I'm not a salesperson or anything, right? But I know it's a lot cheaper than other commercial offerings, for Java application servers. And in many cases, or in this particular one, it's very easy to upgrade. Like we have this tool called Transformation Advisor, which you can download for free for 60 days to give it a try. And that tool basically tells you, hey, if you want to convert your, let's say, WebSphere or Tomcat or JBoss or WebLogic application into OpenLiberty, here's what you need to change, right? And again, that saves a lot of money for license costs just to use open source software in the stack.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, there's there are ways and means where you can get the paid support that you need. So it's a lot of times people worry about open source being, yeah, it's free to use, but then how do you maintain it? And it actually gets very expensive in production. But you're right. There we have partners, and like you said, IBM and Red Hat. We have the ways to support companies and developers, even when using our open source offerings.
Yeah,
That's great. Let's go back to what you talked about earlier about being more agile. I really like what you said in the blog. You said deployments of new versions of monolithic applications are typically difficult, time-consuming, and dangerous. So we saw this movement from going from monoliths to going into microservices. And back when this movement started, a lot of people said, a lot of people gave the same arguments that you're giving in this blog, right? To why you should move from monolith to microservices. Now, my question would be: is microservices a kind of modern app development or modernizing an app? You explained it's a lot more than just tooling and frameworks. But I guess I'm wondering what's the difference between going the microservices way and modernizing your app, and are they complementary to each other?
yeah, yeah. No, that's a good point. And just to be clear, I do not think that it makes sense to modernize every application. Like there are certainly reasons why you just want to keep them running, right? Never touch a running system. Okay, so if you have an application that has lots of dependencies to other middleware, or if you have an application where you don't even have developers, anymore who could change it, like example COBOL, sometimes it just doesn't make sense to change them, right, and to modernize them.
And that's making a comeback, right? COBOL is making a comeback.
Yeah, well, let's see. Uh, and then the same thing for the whole discussion, monolithic architectures versus microservices. I mean, sometimes it just doesn't make sense to break down applications into microservices. Like I've seen examples where, applications that only had 20, 30 classes were broken down into microservices. That doesn't make any sense. That just adds complexity, and you add a lot of network traffic between the microservices. That having said, there are certainly lots of scenarios where it does make sense to break down these big applications into microservices. And the main reason is, kind of what I said at the beginning, you can update these microservices independently from each other. Like you don't have to understand the application as a whole anymore. Just to give an example, when I was young, I worked on IBM Notes or Lotus Notes at that point. And that was a product that has been around or had been around for years, if not decades. And it had like millions lines of code. And everyone was scared to touch the system. Like, even for a relatively simple one-line change, you wouldn't find developers who felt comfortable to change it, right? Because who knew about the side effects? It was, this big thing, and you had no idea what would happen, right? So with microservices, you split down these big monolithic architectures into smaller parts, and you don't have to understand the whole of the application, but you can focus on, your microservice, and I think that's a huge, huge advantage, especially when it comes to not only to make developers more productive, but also to, do these little changes, and do them, being comfortable that you don't break so many other things that you have no clue about.
Right.
So, yeah.
Actually, that's a very good segue into the next point you have, which is technical debt. And I think what you mentioned there kind of is a kind of technical debt, or the developing applications in that way, where it's a big application with a lot of complicated code and features that people don't understand, leads to more technical debt faster, perhaps, than breaking down the problem into smaller pieces that work independently and are sort of loosely coupled to each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, having a monolithic architecture doesn't mean necessarily that it's bad code. I mean, you can also have a really great monolithic architecture as long as you keep it up to date, as long as you keep refactoring it, right? If you don't need some code, remove it, right? It's obvious, but people or developers are scared, right? Because they don't know, is it used and when and for what scenarios and whatever. So I do think that you can also write really good monolithic code as long as you keep it up to date and refactor. But it does make it simpler if you have the microservices, because they're just so much smaller, and you can understand them much better, as I said earlier. So yeah, it's technical debt is a big problem with applications that have been around for a long time. And again, from my own experience, I know that sometimes 80% of the code was not even used. And that's scary, right? Because you keep updating it, you keep running the unit tests and so forth, right? And it certainly makes sense to go back to the code and again, as I said, keep updating it on a regular basis.
Right. So I imagine refactoring not only allows you to then, in this task of modernization, if you choose to do that, make it easier to start on this journey. But also, if you're not thinking about modernization at all, as you said, refactoring is still a good thing and should be done often than not.
Right. Yep.
Okay, that's perfect. The next argument we have on the blog is, this one is very interesting to me. So run mission critical applications on future ready platforms.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot to break down there. So when you say mission critical applications, I'm wondering what does that mean, and also what do you mean by future ready platforms?
Yeah. Okay. That one is a little bit more difficult to explain. So with mission critical, I refer to, enterprise, for applications that are important to run an enterprise, okay, which is not necessarily, for example, a vacation planner, right? And vacation planner is something you can, you don't have to implement anymore because there's thousands of programs that do exactly that. But, mission critical means it's something that, you sell or you stand for, right? It's something that makes up your whole business.
It's your bread and butter, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I mean with a mission critical. Well, future ready platform is even a little bit harder to explain. I mean, obviously, you always want to use the right platform for the next decade or decades, and it's sometimes not that easy to pick the right one, right? But what I'm saying here is that it doesn't really make sense to use these proprietary, let's say, programming language specific stacks, I think. Because I think that's one of the main value adds of Kubernetes. Kubernetes to me feels like the operating system for the cloud, and not only in the public cloud but also on premises. So the operating system for everything related to cloud native application development. And I think the big difference to old systems like WebSphere network deployment, but also many other ones, right, is that you use this platform no matter how you implement your code, right? At the end, a container is a container is a container, right? And you know how to manage it, you know how to operate it, and I think that's really one of the big advantages here of Kubernetes, as well as extensibility. So Kubernetes has lots of extension points. You can build your own custom resource definitions, which makes it really a great platform for so many different use cases and so many different companies to base on. I just remember a couple of years ago when Kubernetes came out, 5, 6 years ago, I don't know. Everyone said, yeah, it's really nice, but you cannot use it to run databases. But now, Kubernetes supports via the extension points stateless sets and volumes, right? And as you know, Oskar, we run our databases on top of it, right? The
Right.
IBM databases in the public cloud. And this has been a huge success, and it certainly is possible. And I think that's one of the nice things about Kubernetes. It's extensible. It has a huge community. It's independent of programming languages. And I think it's really the platform for the next years, if not decades to come. And whatever I would do, I would bet on that platform at that point in order to host my applications.
It's hard to be future proof, but we can all be future ready in some ways. So I like the wordings you used in the blog. All right, great. This actually I love how you wrote this blog, Nicholas. That everything, all of these points kind of roll into the next point. So the next thing you talk about is operational efficiency.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I mentioned it a couple of times. Kubernetes allows you to develop applications however you like, whatever programming language you like, and then you have a container. And that makes the operations much more simple, much simpler. Because you don't have to understand the differences for logging or matrix or monitoring for these different programming languages. You don't have to use thousands of different tools. You use one set of standard tools to find out where's my log and how much memory do I need and so forth. And I think that simplifies the operations significantly.
Right.
So this is not really something that many developers care about or have cared about in the past. But it's certainly a major point here and something developers have to be aware of. And it just makes the operations simpler and thus also cheaper.
Right. And the way we bring up Kubernetes, we've brought up Kubernetes a bunch of times here. So I know a lot of developers are hesitant. If somebody is a Node.js developer and works on Express frameworks, or maybe somebody else is doing Django, it can be a little bit intimidating to jump into this whole new world where it feels like it'll take a lot to learn. But it's amazing when I started looking at Kubernetes, how quickly you can get started with these, especially the managed versions like we have on IBM Cloud called IKS, IBM Kubernetes Services, and Red Hat OpenShift.
Exactly. And there's also lots of tools that make it really easy for developers, right? Like a good example here is MicroProfile. It's basically an extension to Jakarta EE, but you can also use it separately, for example, in Quarkus, which is my favorite Java framework at this point. And it gives you, the abilities to do health checks and logging and matrix, security via JWT tokens. And it's all based on standards. And, as a developer, you just, use a couple of annotations and, make it really simple for your operations engineers, to see this data real time.
Which is exactly what you're saying in your argument number 7 in the blog, which is to increase developer productivity and leverage the developer workforce. At the end of the day, that's the goal, isn't it? Like I understand the external goal is to develop an amazing user experience and build something useful for your external users, and make some money. That's the end goal. But how to get there, or who gets you there, are the people, the developers working on these systems and platforms.
Yeah, well said. So, I mean, enterprise applications are primarily done in Java, and we know that, right? And this won't go away. I think Java has a bright future and everything, but when you go to universities or when you talk with young developers, right, they don't necessarily only implement Java code, right? They use Node.js or Go. Well, COBOL, I'm not sure about, but anyway, and you want to be able to hire these people and to make them productive, writing code. And if they have a preference on Node.js or Go or whatever, right, why not? I mean, I think it makes sense to standardize and have best practices to some degree. But at the same time, there's always advantages and benefits of certain programming languages. One is more efficient than the other, uses less memory, or is faster for a certain use case, right? So the nice thing is that you can leverage all of this here. So this is basically about leveraging the developer workforce. But then I'm also a big fan of making developers more productive. As I said, I worked on IBM Notes, which is collaboration software, and not every developer can develop 40 hours a week, right? There's lots of developers who are working in line of business departments, and they have like a few hours a week to do something, and they want to get their job done. They have very specific business requirements, and they just want to get results very fast. Okay, and that's a nice thing about Docker, which is you don't have to set up your development environment for like weeks or so. You get a Docker container, you mount a volume, you install Visual Studio Code or something, and you're ready to go. And I think that's really amazing. That is something that hasn't been possible in the past, right? Because I remember this, it works on my machine.
Yes.
Apology, that doesn't count anymore, right? You need to write it in a container that it works on your machine, and you can be sure that the exact same runtime also works on the public cloud.
Right.
So that's a nice thing about containers in general.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's the exact same runtime, the exact same dependencies, and the third party libraries and all of that coming into the system. And brought up a really good point about the Java being predominant in the enterprise world, and that's changed in the past. It's still changing. A lot of times, it's not the what the language can bring or the small efficiencies in the language itself. You have to use the right platform based on what your developers know and what the team is more familiar with. And having a platform where my team has developed our services in different languages for the same application, and they all talk to each other using Istio or a service mesh like that. Going back to, we are on number 8 now, improving user experiences. And I really like what you said about what you say here about user experiences, because when I'm sure a lot of other people too, when we think about user experience, we think about what we can see, what we can, in some cases, touch, right? So it's our senses that interact with the application, and that is very important, like you said, to give the user a good sensory experience. But I like how you put improving user experiences. You say faster response time, resiliency, backend for mobile apps, etc. So all of that goes into supporting what the user is seeing at the end.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, what matters is to make your users happy, right? You want them to come back, you want them to use your application or website or whatever. And if you only, in quotation marks, only modernize the application to move it from one infrastructure to the other, that often doesn't change a thing for end users or for the users of your application. And I think people should consider that when modernizing applications, it's not only good enough to upgrade the infrastructure or use a new framework, but also think about the user experience, right? Think about, adding new functionality or changing the UI, using modern web frameworks, providing a mobile web experience, a mobile app experience, these kinds of things. And I think at the end of the day, it probably will make the biggest difference. I mean, it's not only about saving costs, it's not only about being more agile, it's also about providing a better user experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm astonished when I go to certain sites on my mobile phone or on my iPad, and they're not responsive, and they have this, they show me. And I feel like I understand I'm not supposed to use this application on mobile phone, but there's no reason not to show me a more friendly or friendlier user experience
Yeah,
than what they have.
that's a good example, especially responsive UIs, right? I mean, it's like, one day effort to use Bootstrap or Carbon Design or what have you, right? And then you get such a better experience compared with everything that used to be possible like 10 years ago.
Hmm.
So like Dojo and other of these frameworks which didn't know about mobile or small devices at all, right? So these are kind of the low-hanging fruits, as I would call them. Like if you have a good abstraction, like if you have, the backend, and in the best case, even an API management on top of that, re-implementing the web experience is often rather simple.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And then you also talk about maintaining and handling expensive legacy applications.
Yeah, as I said, sometimes it just doesn't make sense to touch your running systems,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
sometimes, it's easier to migrate or modernize your application or replace it with software as a service, right? Like the vacation planner example that I talked about earlier. I mean, why would anyone write a vacation planner these days anymore? But when I started to write code, I mean, in fact, I remember exactly that basically every company implemented their own vacation planner, and that doesn't make any sense, right? And there are many other use cases which are very similar.
But last but not the least, point number 10 is make managers happy. So,
Yeah,
so I understand, and you say there this is not a really good reason, but something you've heard from developers. So tell us what you've heard.
yeah, yeah. As I said, it's not really a good reason just because your manager thinks it's good. You have to be convinced. You need to understand the benefits, etc. Right? But it happens, right? I've talked with developers at conferences, meetups, etc. And I hear that all the time. Like, my manager said we should use framework XYZ, and they don't
Hmm.
have a good reason, but you have to do it. And again, it's not a really good reason, but look at it from the other side. I mean, as a developer, we love learning new stuff, right? And if your manager tells you to use modern frameworks, why not? So, um,
Yeah.
do it for you, right? Just learn new things, new technologies, um, improve your skills in certain areas. So again, it's not a good reason maybe for the company, but certainly for the developers. And why not? We all love learning new things.
Right, we absolutely do. And I think your blog has a list of 10 reasons, or nine, if I take the last one out, that people can actually use to justify, app modernization if it does make sense. Um, Nicholas, do you mind touching a little bit on more on what you mean when you say not all applications need to be, should be, or can be modernized? So, you said if something's running, if something's, it's your sort of your bread and butter and it's running, maybe don't touch it. What are some of the other criteria you would say to not think about app modernization?
Well, I think it boils down to how many dependencies does an application have, and number two, do you still have, the skills to actually change things? Like, if you have an application that is connected to lots of databases, it uses messaging, other proprietary software, then it's really hard to modernize the application as a whole, maybe certain parts. And in general, that sometimes makes sense, right? If you modernize applications, you certainly don't do it in one step. Like you have, a whole process. First of all, you move, the workload from a VM into a container. Then you start using a modern framework. And then you use things like what is called a strangler pattern, which is kind of interesting, which means you pick the best candidate, of a microservice and move that out of the monolith. And you continue doing that until you don't really have the monolith anymore or you don't need it anymore. So it's a big process, and sometimes that is possible, and sometimes not. Again, because of dependencies and also skills. Because let's
Mhm.
face it, some applications have been implemented in programming languages, and you don't where you don't find junior developers or any developers anymore for it, right? And in that
Right.
case, you should really consider whether you really want to touch that system.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense to me. And then so finally, Nicholas, if let's say I think I'm ready. I want to, and me and my team. my manager is on board, everybody is on board, and we want to go ahead and start this process. I know you have another blog where you talk about some of the toolings that IBM has provided. Can you touch a little bit on how to get started? Where should I go? What's my first step?
Yeah, I think I would just Google for IBM app modernization, and that will probably direct you to what we call our IBM Garage pages. IBM Garage is basically, a service department within IBM, and they help customers to understand cloud native development in general, and they help them to understand their requirements. Like they do a lot of design thinking, and they have really nice reference architectures to do app modernization. And they walk you through, basically the different tools step by step to, how can you actually modernize? Because, as I said earlier, the first thing is you need to educate your developers what the goal is, right? And after that, the next thing is you need to identify the applications that you really want to modernize. Because very often it's not the one application, very often it's like hundreds of applications. If you run an enterprise, if you have a data center, you often have hundreds of applications, right? And you need, a good process to really modernize them. And that's really where the IBM Garage can help a lot. And where we also have tools like, as I said, the Transformation Advisor, or even tools that you can install into Eclipse that help you to migrate from, let's say, WebSphere to OpenLiberty, etc. That's exactly where these tools come into play and really help you to get started much simpler. These
Right.
tools are no magic, I have to say, to be very frank and clear here. There is nothing like a magic one-click migration or modernization button. It doesn't exist. It's different for every application. But
Right.
the more tools you can use, the better, right? And at least they give you some hints as to how many applications do you have, which ones are the ones that are used most often, which ones are using, this application stack versus another, and how complicated is it roughly to, move them over into the new world. So whatever you can use in terms of tools, the more the better. And again, there's no automation, but it helps you to make wise decisions as to what applications to start with.
Right. No, and I'm guessing if you once you start using these tools, you may find things you didn't know about your existing system
Oh,
or,
yeah.
or your application.
That's one of the main challenges, right? Which is you need to understand the goal, like the new world, what is cloud native, what is microservices, but you also need to understand like the old world, like how was a Java EE application written 10 years ago, right? And there aren't that many developers who know both of these worlds, right?
Right.
So whatever you can get in terms of tooling support, the better.
No, perfect. I think I'll have to bring you back to do maybe another video on what these different tools are and how we can use them. But thank you so much, Nicholas, for spending time with me today. This was very helpful. I think your blog is very well written, and I'll share it in the comments below. So again, thank you so much for coming on this video.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Opkar. Thanks for having me.